Well, thank you very much for that welcome and introduction, Ingrid. I'm so happy to start this assignment. I've been connected with SLU Ultuna for some years in just teaching at some courses. Especially, I've been mostly involved in a course called Large-Scale Landscape, which is a sister course to the Large-Scale Landscape in Alnarp. And I'm also very happy to see that a lot of you who are listening, I know I've met you, which is a new experience, because often when I hold lectures, I don't know who I'm meeting for the first time, and I'm not always aware of how much they know. So I think the challenge for me today will be that I'm coming in as a practitioner, and I'm sure I'm going to say a lot of things that a lot of you already know very well. But I think one thing you can't underestimate is that we're all starting at the same spot. So I think there's no risk in me saying perhaps some of the obvious things and taking you on a small journey why I'm here as this assignment as an adjunct artistic professor. Is that the right term? Yes, it's a very long term. So I think we'll find just call me Emelie. Okay. So I thought before I actually start talking about the topic, I'd like you to just see this image. This is a picture from my office. Besides now my new employment, I'm working at a company called Landskapslaget, Ingrid mentioned, and we are about 40 people working both with landscape architecture, landscape planning, urban design, urban planning and stuff like that. And we're situated only in Stockholm, but we work all over Sweden. And this specific image is from one of the events we are arranging to enhance the public space, because we've found over the years that how to influence the life in the city and landscape architecture is to involve earlier on in the processes, in the strategic planning, and also to involve in incorporating or collaborating with people who are using these spaces. So this is just a snapshot from one of those occasions where we had we moved the office outside, and we arranged open lectures about culture taking place in the city. Yes. So I think one of the reasons why I'm here today is actually a lot thanks to the Transport Administration, because this has been a very important collaborating partner for me for many years. And that's why today in this lecture I will take that as a framework, you could say, for some of the things I'm going to describe. This quote, the Swedish Transport Administration is creating the largest transformation since the Ice Age, is a kind of general saying within Trafikverket, or the Transport Administration. This is quite a big attempt. It's also quite alarming that one authority is doing so much changes that it may influence us at the same level and the same scale as natural processes did once upon a time. So why are we saying this? Let me go back for one here. Well, how come we are saying that the Transport Administration is creating so much change? Well, one good measurement is this. Every 10 years, there's a national investment plan that is produced in Sweden. Then it's being updated, but that's kind of the big framework is set for 10 years. And in the present national investment plan that we're in, this was the budget that was decided on. So this is 622.5 miljarder or billion Swedish crowns. This is a huge amount of money, really a huge amount of money. Of course, when you have this kind of money, you also have a big responsibility, and you're strong and you can do a lot of damage, and you might even do a lot of good if you use this money in a good way. So for quite some time before the Transport Administration became a joint authority for both rail, road and waterways, even the road administration, Vägverket, has acknowledged their impact in the landscape and has also been working a lot with methods and ways to try and to mitigate the harm, basically, in what transport infrastructure does in the landscape. So at the same time as we have this huge investment, we have the other challenges that goes on. We have a changing climate, and we have an urgent need to strengthen biodiversity. So we need to combine these kind of different trends of we need to build more, we have an increasing urbanization, yet at the same time we need to build in a different way, and we need to consider the natural systems in a much greater degree than we've done before. So going back, which is something I think a lot of you already know who are listening to this speech today, is that the way we are describing the landscape in our sort of general, what we can find, the knowledge we can find about the landscape, and how we evaluate the landscape looks a bit like this. We have perhaps designated areas which have been decided on having a certain value. So the landscape is described in patches, you could say. And the legislation, with the whole kind of thread going, if you look at say a road planning project with the environmental impact assessment, there's still a lot of focus on if we are hitting these places or if we're missing these special areas. So we might have a very deep and specialized knowledge into these specific areas, and also a very specialized knowledge considering the different disciplines. If you are acquainted with an environmental impact assessment, for example, we are describing the effects on the natural habitats, and we're describing the cultural aspects and the visual impact, for example. So this is still a kind of, we've been doing it for a while, but it's still a very kind of distinct way of working. Are we missing? Are we hitting? And that's the way the landscape is often assessed. So this is also something that the Transport Administration is kind of, the business as usual has been, or was before this project that I'm going to talk about, has been worked a bit like this. So without sort of going too far into all the different stages of why we are protecting our land, or the development of the legislation or anything, I'm not going to go into that. And it was only a few days ago I was reading in the new book of landscape character assessment that you gave me, Ingrid, the Rootleg Handbook of Landscape Character Assessment. And for those of you who haven't read there, I can advise you to read a bit about landscape as a theme in Swedish planning, because that really gives a good kind of overview how the landscape has been managed on a legal basis. But it's still, if you just want to sort of make a short turn back, why we're doing this and how far back it's going, you could ask yourself why we're talking about designated areas. And I found this parallel to something we sometimes call the very Eurocentric approach to describing the land. There is an old term that was used in the Roman days called Terra nullis. I'm not sure about the pronunciation here, probably pronounce something else. And it basically means nobody's land. This is a land to claim or to look at. Is this something we could make use of? So during the big era of the 18th and 19th century, when the Western world, the European world, was doing the imperialistic actions all over the world, like in this very kind of strong image of Africa, there was a lot of interest being put into cartography, which was, if you look at it the neutral way, the art, science, and technology of drawing maps. But of course, it wasn't just that. It was very political. And we all know that the act of drawing a line can be a very political one. And an even more political one is the act or the power of drawing a map. So I'd like to ponder a bit upon this, the power of drawing a map, because a map is a very important tool in how we look upon the landscape. So this beautiful image is from that time, you could say, when the Europeans were so happy to make maps of everything and compare and to assess the use and the resources of the world, basically outside Europe. Who holds the pen? What's the purpose of the map? And now I'm showing you this specific image because I think it's a very beautiful one. It's about the comparison. This image is showing, I must actually look at my other screen because it's so small. It's giving us a descriptive comparison of the different rivers and mountain ranges in the world. So it's sort of, you know, almost like comparing how are the Andes compared to the Himalayas, and how is the Alps compared to blah blah blah. And this was kind of to give a meaning in the to understand the world that was new to the people who came, and to this terra nullis, which is a very Eurocentric approach to mapping. Yes, so what we're seeing now then is that maps and the act of drawing a line is determining different actors in the landscape. And the Transport Administration, they act and work within their framework. Now, their framework is to build and maintain transport infrastructure. That's kind of that's the task they are given from the government. And this image that I'm showing you here is an example from a project we are working on right now, trying to assess how can we increase landscape adaptation, or the adaptation of transport infrastructure to the landscape, when we are constructing new railway lines in southern Sweden. So this is the big project called Nya stambanor, where we're trying to give guidance in how, why, and where do we need to adapt to the landscape. So the image here, it's showing a kind of a, if you think of a traffic light, where the green is okay and the red is not okay. This is kind of the legal framework. It's okay to work within the actual the building, the construction. It's not a problem. There's a legislation to help us with this. There's also room for some kind of adaptation in the near the vicinity of the transport system, but as soon as we start to leave it, then we're working against the legislation that we have today, against the kind of the area or the line where we are supposed to be working in. So the problem here is, what if these kind of wicked problems and this biodiversity loss and climate change and social equality, what if that happens outside this framework? How can we see to that we are supporting the things that make the whole landscape function? So we need to perhaps expand the idea of keeping within our frame. And this is, of course, not new. It's not. It was a long time ago since we only worked within the different limitations. But when we look at the legislation, it's still very, very connected to the different responsibilities in the landscape, which is a problem. So in 2010, the Transport Administration initiated a research and innovation project called Landscape in Long-Term Spatial Planning, as Ingrid mentioned earlier. And the idea here was to see if you could make this transit from the left corner here, which is our present legislation with the national planning, you could say, or the spatial planning that goes on in the municipalities and in the regional scale with transport infrastructure, to a collaborative, sustainable kind of approach to planning. So this was kind of the objective of starting this project that I also was involved in for 7 years. And this was also because at the time, the European Landscape Convention had been ratified by Sweden, and all the different authorities and the governmental bodies were trying to find out in what way they could work in accordance to the European Landscape Convention. And pretty quickly, the Transport Administration realized that, okay, maybe we have a bit of a way to go. We need to make this movement from the avoiding the infringement to actually noticeably improving something. We need to work in a completely different way. So we need to probably develop new methods and new structures to do this. This image is something I borrowed. It's from Val Kirby and Natural England. I think it's a good example because if we leave the designated areas and look at the landscape in this way, a complex image of many different layers, then we're starting to understand that it's very unfortunate just to describe one of these aspects at a time. We need to understand the whole combination of these aspects. And of course, as most of you also listening know, the European Landscape Convention also puts a lot of focus on that this is the democratic right to the landscape, that man is a part of the landscape, but also the landscape is part of man, that we co-create the landscape, and that we're also entitled to influence the landscape in some way. So the approach of planning through evaluated specific areas by specialists is not aligned with the European Landscape Convention. It's too narrow. So the European Landscape Convention also is a very good kind of pointer in a different, more sustainable direction. And even if we have this kind of idea that we want to do things in a good way, and the landscape is something we all care about, it often this is what often happens. We take the landscape for granted, and when it comes to the detail, you say the devil, or what do you say, the devil lives in detail, or God lives in the detail. This is what happens. This is not enhancing anything. It's just business as usual. It doesn't have to be this way. So with this kind of ambition of changing the outset, the initial parts of the project was to identify that what we need to do is to find information earlier on in the process when the time has just begun, because then we can really it's really possible to influence the development in a sustainable way. So the specific task was to find a tool to assess, to understand, to communicate the landscape as a whole, and in accordance to the ELC, the European Landscape Convention. And to do that, we needed to start off by describing the landscape as a whole. If we look at the national plan, for example, as I mentioned, with a huge budget, and the regional plans for transport infrastructure, there's a lot in the plans which doesn't have a geography. It just says, okay, we need to improve the roads so heavier lorries can travel upon these roads or whatever. So even if we have kind of a vague measures, there's a lot of vague measures going on in the landscape, then there's even less chance to understand what's going to happen in the landscape if we're going to have a hit and miss. So what this project aimed to do, which is a typical example then of what, if you have an authority like the Transport Administration, you have an objective, you want to make a movement, you have funding for research to develop a methodology, then you are actually able to assess and perhaps find a process or a toolkit or something. So this is kind of let me show you the next picture. This is kind of it puts it all in there, what the method is, the integrated landscape character assessment, which the name is. I'm not going to go into all the bits and pieces here, but just a very general thing. The characterization of the landscape is a key to this methodology. It's based on the landscape character assessment methods from Great Britain. And it's about describing the landscape, both its character and its function, and to divide it into areas, not because you're drawing the map, you're not going to use the land for anything. You just need to have a common speaking terms. Yeah, the landscape is an arena. And you need to find some in-depth information. So you have these thematic studies, which are at the bottom here: the ecology, the time depth, the form of the landscape. And you also need to have some kind of assessment. Where's the landscape going? Where's it heading? Where does it lead us? Are there functions or structures in the landscape which are actually sensitive to something? Is there potential to enhance something? So this kind of wraps up the methodology in itself, the landscape character, the integrated landscape character assessment. And why is it called integrated landscape character assessment then? Well, the LCA, the landscape character assessment, that's something which is already kind of established. It's often done by landscape architects, for example. But the important part of this toolkit or this methodology is that the thematic studies gives a very important explanation of how the landscape functions, and that's an integration in that we are standing on the three legs of the perception and form, the historical time depth, and the ecology. But then the other thing which is very important is the way we are looking ahead. What can we foresee? What can we do to strengthen our common landscape to make it more resilient? So just as an example then, this after sort of settling in this kind of the different stages of this methodology, it's also been applied in many different projects now. The development started in 2010, and sort of the project kind of finished in 2017 when we produced an English version of the method report. So you could say from 2012 up till now, this methodology has been tried and applied in many different larger scale landscape infrastructure projects. So this is one example, for example, where we did integrated landscape character assessment in different stages. Here as a strategic measurements. I don't know if you know the OVS, åtgärdsvalsstudie, which is an early stage in the planning process where you assess a lot of different aspects of the project. Sometimes it leads to actually building infrastructure. Sometimes it leads to some other societal change. So this was from that stage. It contained the characterization, which is in this map extremely large scale. As you can see, I don't know, for most of you will be acquainted with a map here of Sweden. So you will see that almost all of Kronoberg and Jönköpings län, part of Jönköpings län are sort of classified as one landscape character type, for example. And what this image is showing that even on this very large scale, when we still don't know where the actual railway is going to go, we can still find a lot of knowledge of the landscape by describing it in this way, like the plains landscape, the slättlandskap, which occurs in these yellow spots, for example, which are specific character areas. So the characterization is one. This is one example of the characterization, and what is the important thing, which is also very it's old school for you, I guess. It's about what landscape character is, to describe the content, the physical features, the context, what goes on. Now with the context is a bit interesting because in this ILCA, the Integrated Landscape Character Assessment, it's very important to acknowledge the different aspects of the landscape. So you will see the biological systems, you will see the economical systems, perhaps you will see the historical systems and characters or objects. So the context is not describing only the perceived, the visual aspects, but it's describing the all kinds of functionalities in the landscape. So this is just an example. I'm not going to go into this deeply now, but when we communicate with different stakeholders and different roles within the organization of the transport administration, we are finding that these kind of explanations of what we have to work with are very helpful. So we've been working with illustrations as one example of trying to find the characteristics. And in these three thematic studies, then I'm just going to give you a few examples also of the similar area here. This Vättern, and this is the area which includes the railway which goes from Göteborg to Linköping via Jönköping. So in the form of the landscape, we are, of course, describing the geological processes and the scale, the perceived landscape, the landscape visual aspects. In the ecology, this is only two maps. The ecologic thematic studies are very important to find the systems, the living systems in the landscape. And this is extremely important because one of the main criteria of infrastructure, the transport infrastructure, is that it's a system, and it always influences the ecological systems and sometimes the social systems. So in the ecologic thematic studies, we found that we're not getting very far if we're looking at these designated areas where there's been an assessment already. We need to look at a very wide scale. We need to find other kinds of information that it's perhaps not even in databases yet, but that can be done by assessing the water or aerial photography, or there's a lot of different assessments that can be made in the ecological field, which describes functions in the landscape. And the historical time depth, the same thing. If you look at this map to the left, this is the areas which have been described in different plans for municipalities and regions. So it gives us a hint, but it doesn't give us a whole picture. It doesn't give us any information of what goes on between these red and orange dots. So in the thematic studies, it's very important to pinpoint why is the landscape evolved in a way that it looks today. Are there things developments that have been going on that are still trends in the future? And actually it's very interesting because a lot of you could say a problem earlier has been that for a long time the strategic planning has not been geographical. It's been very kind of theoretical. And we need to kind of land on the ground, and we need to find that, okay, hotspots in the Middle Ages are still hotspots, and they probably will be continue. And why is that? Well, it's because of the landscape, of course. It's not just because man made it in a certain way, but it's because maybe resources to live on, or the strategic spot in a whatever. So in the time depth, we are understanding the landscape, and we are given a lot of clues on how to work further on ahead. Yeah, this is also just an illustration of when we characterize, we try to describe these landscape character types in different ways. And another very important part of the aspect of integration and the interdisciplinary approach here is to, when we are talking about the function in the landscape, the character of the landscape, and the relationship to the landscape, then we can actually talk about the different sectors in one go. So, for example, here, the blue, I don't know if you see, but the blue text is words that are often used within visual impact assessment, for example, and how we perceive the landscape, while the red is from the cultural field, so to speak. So by describing the character, function, and relationship we have with the landscape in these mixed interdisciplinary terms, and by describing the sensitivities and potential also in these terms, then we can bring it forward to both talking to the specialists, but also giving a holistic idea. So as a conclusion of this methodology, which is kind of an illustration here that's been used, is that with these thematic studies, we are able to work with the landscape as an arena, and we are given kind of a comprehensive knowledge of the landscape, where we were, where we're going, and it's also a way of starting a discussion with other stakeholders and participation, because we're not judging or evaluating that this landscape is more interesting or more valuable than this or that. We're more describing and discussing the functions and the characters in the landscape. Yeah, there's a lot of publications Ingrid mentioned. This is just a short list where you can find some of this information. So why has then this gone a step further and led to the appointment, for example, for this assignment that I've just started? Well, the challenge here, as the Transport Administration still sees, is that we need to look at transport infrastructure that adapts to the landscape even more than it has done earlier. And the example of the methodology of ILCA is one step. It's one method of giving you knowledge about the landscape, but now we're going to take it one step further. So this is a very interesting phase that we're going into. We need to look into how we can sustain functional networks. You know that infrastructure always kind of interferes with other networks. It's just the way it is, and we need to kind of see how, to what extent can we sustain functional networks. And of course, this is not news. We have a whole research, I don't know the term for it, if it's a research studio, whatever, called Triecol at SLU, which is also financed by the Transport Administration, which looks especially into the ecological sustainable functional networks. So they have a very active research since years. I think they have also like a 3-year interval where they so the sustenance of functional networks, social as well, to enhance the perception or the perceived landscape. How can infrastructure actually contribute to our common environment to achieve the sustainability goals of a built environment and a healthy environment? How can we even discuss creating new values through infrastructure? This is a very interesting topic, and this is where we are really going into the design phase of creating all this infrastructure. Two very different situations. This is, you may be alarmed at the amount of hard surface here, but let me tell you that there's an explanation for everything. And this, in a hardscape landscape like this, it's a very well looked after landscape, considering the layers of functions that goes on in this specific spot. But I'm not going to go into that right now. So the Transport Administration has different guidelines and different plans for achieving a better transport infrastructure. One is this is the architecture policy, which is a very important kind of framework to say what the transport infrastructure can do, what can it contribute with in how we perceive and our built environment, basically. But then there's also this, which I thought I'd mention, and maybe you already know this. The Transport Administration has a research and innovation program, and it contains 7 portfolios. I haven't translated this into English, but it contains planning, sustaining. I didn't translate this before. Making things happen, building within the sea trade, within the air, and strategic initiatives. These are kind of portfolios which collect a lot of different projects, which are a part of this innovation plan. And this research and innovation plan has presently also a very large budget. From 20 to 29, there's a budget of 8 billion Swedish crowns for going into research and innovation. So one of the reasons why Trafikverket is now sponsoring an adjunct artistic professor is because there is an aim to develop different things in this plan. Now, these are kind of quite general things, I think, but interesting to mention. The plan talks about conversion to a climate neutral transport system, to have a secure and robust infrastructure in the digital society or the digital era, an efficient transport system for business and inhabitants, an equitable and inclusive system in the urban and rural context. And in the portfolio of bygga, construct or build, that's where the financing is coming from for this, the professor, the adjunct professor. And the strategy then is to, on a kind of overall level, is to develop strategic alternatives, to build knowledge and capacity, to start up test beds and demonstrations, and as an identified specific action, landscape adaptation on infrastructure functionality. So every year there's a seminar, and there's also a report that describes different initiatives and research projects that are going on or have been going on. So I just mentioned a few of these within this portfolio, bygga, which is, well, decent soundscape in railway towns. Okay, this is not a very good translation, but making it it's an issue because we are going to see more railways. We already have railways. How do we approach the noise issue and make it still a good built environment? Another project, as an example from the last report, is increasing the biodiversity in the transport system, where there's a focus on pollinators. And another one is looking into side areas, which maybe look at the detail, but extremely important when we are building new railway lines all over southern Sweden. So the task that I'm involved in now is to explore and develop the topic of landscape adaptation of infrastructure. And I will be appointed for 3 years with maybe 3 years more. The placement is SLU Alnarp, and there's also a plan to have 3 research positions. I'm sure there's another word for this, but I'm still not accustomed to the academic language. So if you have a different language, different word here, please say it. But you understand. And I think what I want us to do together is basically 4 things. I think there's four different steps in this, which will be very fantastic, interesting journey to embark on. The first is to collect. We always need to know where you are. We need to find out more about contemporary practice, contemporary issues. There are problems or possibilities within the transport administration, within the people who are working with transport infrastructure, the universities, and so on. So the first step is really to collect, to have a new base of knowledge, which is updating the field of transport infrastructure and landscape architecture and landscape adaptation. The next step, I think, or this is of course, these go parallel, is to connect. There is a big need to network, to find collaborations, to work with arranging seminars and what do you say? Pitching into ongoing research and see how this can be interconnected. All these wise thoughts and ongoing processes and projects. And this will probably go on both within SLU, it will extend to other stakeholders and also other universities. So this is yet to be worked out, but it's one of the important things to collaborate and to connect. Then, of course, we need to produce something. I'm usually a consultant, and we always have a result. And so what we need to do is really to conclude and to create. So in the conclude, we need to to see, this is just an example from a different slide where what the ILCA can do, but I think it really is quite a good, this shape hypothesis. If we have all these new problems or new issues, or we do need to do it in a new way, we need to build an understanding, we need to shape an hypothesis to be able to make better decisions. So this is what the conclusion is all about. And this can be done in different ways. I'm really hoping it's going to be done through the course, the curriculum, and the education, but also in the method of how we do things. The iterative and the design thinking is a very important tool for this. And of course, create. This is the kind of, okay, what are we achieving? Well, we are going to develop, we're going to look into how the courses and perhaps studios can develop. Of course, we need to produce things like articles, seminars I mentioned earlier, and test beds, which is something I really look forward to looking into. What are the test beds? So these four kind of strategies for is how I see this assignment, how it's going to work. And I'm very much looking forward to being a part of the academic partnership as well. I will still, of course, be working the other part of my time. I'll still be in my ordinary job. So I think hopefully it will give a very good kind of the pollination here will hopefully be very fruitful. So I think I'll leave it at that and open up to questions. Thank you.